Thank you all very much indeed for coming. My name is Austin Williams. I'm the director of the Future Cities Project. And apparently you have some gallant folk from America and Australia in the audience. So it's good morning, good night, good evening to most of you, I'm sure. So on that note, just to say, we hope to have a more global version of this discussion later on this year, looking at China, America, and parts of the Middle East, just trying to work out what kind of issues there are, how they're being addressed on a different scale, and maybe what lessons we can learn in this country. So today's discussion is going to be a more local focus on real problems that have been around for years. My colleague Alistair Donald there is the convener of the Living Freedom Educational Initiative, and he's on hand if anything happens to my signal. So fingers crossed for that. On that note, we have a couple of Tories presenting tonight, if you remember the Tories. I was reading that the Conservative government was elected on a manifesto to build 300,000 homes in every year, and that was the 1951 manifesto. They didn't manage it then, and they haven't managed it now. But that said, the peak of house building, in this country at least, was the late 1960s under the Labour Party, when we built twice as many homes as we do today, although, of course, much of it was crap, ending with the catastrophe of Ronan Point. So there is a question about, do we need more quality and less focus on quantity, or should we be arguing for both? And I suppose that's something of a strategic aim that we should be aiming for. The government is now on the 16th housing minister. It's hard to believe that that's 3 times the number of prime ministers that they've had. But there's a clear need for housing. There's a huge housing industry dedicated to providing it. So the big question is why is it not happening? And why hasn't it happened for such a long time? So there's some questions to think about. There's more than this, but I'll just throw a few in there. Is the problem NIMBYism? Is it environmental restrictions? Is it immigration? Is it greedy builders? Is it bureaucracy? Is it a lack of political will? Or is it an impossible task? An ever-moving goalpost. So just some questions to address, and we've got a very good panel to ponder on those or other questions. And the way it works is this: I have asked the panelists to speak for 4 minutes or so, 4 or 5 minutes, to set out their stall. Then we'll have a little bit of argy-bargy on the panel amongst ourselves, and then it'll be out to you, the audience, for questions and comments. And feel free to raise things, not just questions. It's a free, frank, no holds barred conversation tonight. We are recording it, so please mute if you're not contributing. And let me introduce the speakers. So first of all, we have Simon Cook, who's an urbanist, former leader of the Conservative group at Bradford City Council, where he also held the regeneration portfolio for 6 years. He's the author of an excellent booklet, which in many ways was the kickstart to this conversation, Letters on Liberty in Defence of a New Suburbia. Next, we'll have Sean Bailey, Lord Bailey of Paddington. He's chair of the House of Lords Housing Committee. He started as a youth worker for the Blenheim Project in Ladbroke Grove and later co-founded My Generation, helping combat social problems affecting young people and their families. He then moved into politics in the local assembly as a member and was then the Conservative Party candidate for the Mayor of London. London's loss is the House of Lords' gain. He became a peer of the realm last year. Calvin Poe is an architectural critic for The Spectator and writes much more widely than that. He's a strategic designer at Dark Matters Lab. He trained as an architect at the Bartlett School of Architecture and the AA and has worked on mixed-use regeneration projects in London and beyond. His personal research, which is specifically interesting for this discussion, is focused on the English planning system, its history, and speculating on decentralized models for the regulation of the built environment more broadly. And then, last but not least, we have Helen McNeil, who's an architect and consultant architect at Shed KM. She oversaw the design and construction of 142 homes, 450 student rooms, offices, and retail at Circle Street in Brighton, which was named Building of the Year in the Architect's Journal. She is the principal of Honest Architecture and founder of HA! A series of free speech dinners for the architectural industry, and a fantastic venture it is too. So that's your lot. That's enough from me for a while. Simon, can you kick things off for us, please?
I can, and thank you, Austin. Fixing housing should be the #1 priority for government, at least in Britain. And you don't fix housing by subsidising rents, cramming more homes into ever-crowded cities, or giving money to councils. You fix the housing crisis by allowing people who own land to build homes on that land. I want to just look at 4 factors. The first one is that we're already at least 1.5 million homes short of what we need. Some people, Centre for Cities, for example, argue as much as 4 million homes short. And we need to close that gap. And safety issues aside, we can't afford to be too picky about how we do it. The population of London increased 50% since 1980. Yet unlike Paris, London's development boundaries have barely budged. We're failing Londoners and increasingly failing residents of other cities by cramming them into smaller and smaller spaces. Britain now has both the smallest and the most expensive housing in Europe. I think there are too many excuses made for why Britain doesn't build. Too few builders, not enough bricks, greedy developers, right to buy, when the biggest reason stares us right in the face. In 1947, we nationalised land use, deciding that you needed to ask your local council's permission if you wanted to build pretty much anything. Too often, though, and especially in the architecture and urban design businesses, people seem to want to use the built environment as a tool for social engineering, to save the planet, to get rid of cars, to create efficient living. You know, something people want: a house, a garden, a space for their car. Why stop them? The first priority is to change the planning system so as to remove the power of local activists and councillors to block development. And this building is unsafe, or the place is especially important, we should not have constraints to development. People shouldn't have to ask for permission first, and they should be able to do that with their own resources and their own risk what they wish. We can't fix housing without fixing planning. But once we've done this, I hope we can then look to other places to see what they do, to look to Sweden, where 80% of homes are modular, a hint there, plants and trees, to Austria, where over 60% of new homes are self-built, and to places like Hungary, Slovakia, and Czechia, where over 80% of people own the homes they live in. And finally, we need to stop sneering at suburbia. Previous housing crises of standards, of demand and of supply were fixed in large part by building suburbs. In the 1850s, around the turn of the 20th century, and in the 1930s, private developers built spacious, attractive new homes for families. Even the housing surge of the 50s and 60s, at least until the late 60s, involved building suburban housing. So we need to replace the Town and Country Planning Acts with a system that's pro-housing and pro-development, learn from what works elsewhere, from Sweden, from France, from Austria, from some US cities, and stop knowing better than ordinary people about how and where they should live. And I think, let's see a new suburbia emerge, read my book, one reflecting 21st century family life, not the industrialized peasantry of the 20th century urbanism. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. That was short and sweet. You obviously spoke faster than you anticipated. Very good. And I think part of what you said there about home ownership abroad, again, when bringing Sean in to speak now, he's just been talking about the idea that we assume home ownership means you own your home in this country, whereas in fact, for many people, leasehold is just glorified tenancy in many respects, with very little authority over what happens to it. So can I bring it, sorry to flag that up, Sean, if that's not what you're going to talk about, but can I bring Sean in next for your 5 minutes, please?
Let me just start with suburbia. I am someone who was born in inner city London to the 20th century peasantry model in a council flat. I aspire to get out to suburbia because there's space for my children, myself, and my love of grass was answered there in a way it was never going to be answered in Zone 2 in Ladbroke Grove. It's interesting that my larger suburban home, 3-bedroom house with garden, is worth less than my 2-bedroom, 5th floor flat in the middle of London. That says something about what's wrong with our housing system. I'm going to jump all over the place, so please pick me up later on. Planning, less planning, more rules. What I mean by that is planning is a moving target that is almost impossible to nail down. One of my goals in becoming Mayor of London, when I wanted to become Mayor of London, was to reduce planning risk from the average of 2 years down to 6 months. The way in which you do that is less planning, more rules. Be very clear what those rules are so that developers, councils, whoever else can then build around those rules and not have to spend so much time in planning. In a perfect world, there'd be no planning. They'd just adhere to the rules and get on with it. When you talk about quality, quality is key because we don't want to keep wasting our money and destroying our environment. And the way to enhance quality, I think, is building regs. I'm a massive fan of building regs. I happen to live in a new build home and they have such a terrible reputation, but I challenge any Victorian or Edwardian house in this country to be as warm as my new build home. I challenge them to be as waterproof as my new build home. I challenge them. The point is modern building regs turn out modern buildings that are good for people and of course can be adjusted. Given my way, I would have made garden cities, many garden cities. The biggest housing squeeze in the country is in the southeast of the country. No, I didn't say in London, in the southeast of the country. London provides people in the southeast of the country with some of the highest paying jobs on the planet, but yet London is expected to deal with its housing problem all on its own. I would have engaged Kent, Surrey, etc., around the boundaries of London and said, let's build some garden cities. And then within those garden cities, I would have built for your route through life. So when you're a young person, you need less space. A garden is an annoyance to you. When you're middle-aged with children, a garden is a thing of beauty and you need more space. When you're older, I would reduce the amount of stairs in your home, but I would give you a big living room in order to have your family around. Giving you a big bedroom is not useful, big living room much more useful. The point I'm making is architecture for the place that you are in your life. We absolutely need to stop treating Britain as if it's a postage stamp and there's no land to build on. There is plenty of land to build on if we change how we view that land. Often when people talk about the green belt, we think of the rolling hills of Yorkshire, or the Peak District, when actually talking about scrubland on the edge of Manchester or London. We need to redesignate this land in order for it to be used in the way it should be. The current push to make cities more and more dense has some value in it, but very quickly will turn cities into rabbit hutches. And we need to plan now to avoid that. And that means looking at where we build, and how we designate the land. We need a countrywide housing plan. And let's be clear, the plan needs to be very, I'd say 5 to 6 lines, not 5 to 6 paragraphs. And it basically needs to say, as a local authority, your responsibility is to build this. If you don't build this, you then lose that responsibility. It comes to central government, and we'll just administer it from Whitehall. I say that to give them the impetus to do something, but also pick them up if they don't want to do something. And finally, I would say this: we need to lower the cost of housing. Of course, that is obvious. The way in which we lower the cost is to increase the supply. Again, rather obvious. But housing is so fundamental to the happiness of a group of people that when you look at Britain and you think the country's in a state, most of the solution to that lies in decent, high quality, affordable housing in many different tenures, not just council housing, not just private housing, all the bits in between, except leasehold, I might add. To help the people of this country actually feel like they have a future where they could decide to live where they live in relative comfort.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Sean. I think obviously there is a big question, always has been, around what affordable housing means, since it's very often unaffordable to most people, only 80% of market sale. But I think you're raising the issue of planning is a very nice hook for Calvin to jump in and either slap you down or to applaud you. I don't know how he's going to go. Calvin.
Well, I wasn't actually planning to speak on planning, but I want to largely echo and agree with Simon and Sean. I think the underlying point about the planning system is predictability. And I think for every planning application that is accepted for a private developer, it's also making up for all the unaccepted planning applications that they had to gamble with, spend loads of consultant fees on, only for the local council to say no. And that's why we kind of end up with developments that are too tall, too dense, too greedy, and too ugly, which only in turn empowers the NIMBYs to kind of fight back even harder. And if we had a rules-based, predictable planning system, like most civilized countries in the world, and not the Stalinist land control system that we have, then we actually might be able to get some housing supply going. But actually, I think that the question that I wanted to talk about is actually an underlying issue of how we think about value. And let's take one of the big questions about new housing. So what new transport infrastructure will serve this housing? Who will want to live in the middle of nowhere, far from social and economic activity and opportunities? And I think what's clear from Simon's excellent publication is that even the Victorians understood the kind of huge value that transport infrastructure created in the land, and that housing and speculative development worked hand in hand together to take advantage of that value under the free market. So, for example, look at Crossrail, which cost £18 billion of mostly public money or public borrowing, and an old and fairly conservative study estimated that this project created £5 billion of land value increases, and this is only within 1 kilometer of Crossrail stations, but only 10% of this was actually captured back for the public purse. And there's a more recent study by KPMG and Savills that kind of totaled up all the new TfL projects, so Crossrail 2, the Bakerloo extension, etc., and they can be funded, their capital cost can be funded almost 2.5 times over by the land value uplift that they're creating in both commercial and residential and retail property. But most of that value that we're creating using public money is going into private pockets, landowners and property owners, homeowners even, around these stations. And this is tantamount to a big public handout to private landowners. And there's been, so what can we do to capture some of that land value and actually use it to kind of make infrastructure development sustainable? Well, there's been some very timid attempts under Crossrail 1 to attempt to capture some of this value through the overstation development model that TfL is just starting to try. But actually, this kind of model of capturing the value that transport investment creates is used very successfully in places like Hong Kong, where I'm from, where the MTR, or kind of public transit company, is actually a profit-generating company because it operates on the rail and property development model. And the model is actually really simple, right? So the MTR Corporation acquires land it needs to build stations and rail, etc. It kind of builds a new rail line, plans the new rail line, and at the same time works with private developers to build housing, shopping malls, shops, schools, whatever, all around that much more valuable land, and uses development as a way of capturing the value that it creates by building a new station, new connection to that area. And the MTR shares these profits with the developers, either as a control over properties or even like as a fixed lump sum. And by capturing the value that value that's increased in the land, MTR actually generates funds for new rail projects. So it's a self-sustaining model, and actually our public transport company does not need any public funding, unlike TfL run by our current mayor, Sadiq Khan, who needs constant bailouts from central government. So, and there's like a stark difference between that, right? And I think in Crossrail 2, they're already starting to consider this idea more seriously, by kind of pushing the rail plus property model a bit more. And what I would argue is that this can also happen outside of London. But I think one key problem is the way that we have privatized rail under the franchise model, which means the profit motive is aligned with cutting quality and cutting costs rather than the development of new infrastructure and better services, right? And I think there are other countries which have fully privatized rail systems, like Japan, for example, where there's constantly new development of train infrastructure. And actually, for these regionally privatized companies, not franchise-based privatized companies, is actually up to a third or even 2/3 of the revenue comes from non-rail related activities such as real estate investment. So that's kind of my food for thought. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Calvin. I suppose having several small c conservative voices here, I still didn't expect everybody to be banging on about the market, which doesn't seem to be serving people as well as you seem to be suggesting it could. And also I was very interested. I mean, I remember when Ken Livingstone banged on about the redevelopment of Stratford and suggested that the increase in value of properties around that area meant that people, because their housing value went up, that they may have to pay back higher interest back into the public purse rather than businesses, ironically. So, these things work both ways when we're talking about increased value on the back of nothing other than other people's development. Anyway, I digress. Helen.
Yes, wonderful. Okay. Right, my name is Helen McNeil, and with over 20 years of experience as an architect, my focus is primarily on delivering build-to-rent high-rise homes in city centres. Currently, I'm leading Shed KM's planning team on Phase 1B of Landsec UNI's Mayfield Master Plan in Manchester, in collaboration with Studio Rig at West. Our aim is not only to deliver new homes, but to create a new neighbourhood and evolve the piece of the city with its own sense of place, rooted in Northern soul grit. In addition to my architectural work, I also organise a series of free speech dinners in London. These events host guests predominantly from the architecture industry, although not exclusively. I initiated the free speech dinners in response to the limited discourse in architecture. There is a lack of opportunity to openly discuss and debate highly politicised issues such as net zero or degrowth. I believe there is a disconnect between architectural education, which often focuses on social justice activism, and finding real-world solutions to actual issues like the housing crisis. I question the role architects can play in solving the housing crisis for young families when they are being educated to espouse ideological concepts like no new building or beyond the nuclear family. We are educating activists and not architects with ideas so far removed from the daily life of the majority of the country. I fear we are losing the ability to even frame an issue honestly and based in reality in order to solve it, rather than through an ideological lens. The simple truth is that demand for housing is outstripping supply, exacerbated by mass immigration. The premise that mass immigration is worsening our housing crisis should not be a controversial point. The government's target of building 300,000 homes a year is based on outdated assumptions about net migration of around 170,000 each year. In reality, in recent years, the net rate of migration has been around 700,000, all of whom need to be housed. Record immigration is not only driving up house prices, but also pushing up rents in the private rental market, which I predominantly work in. In 2022, net migration added at least 500,000 people to England's rental market. It is this mass immigration which partly helps to explain why in 2023, we saw the sharpest rise year-on-year increase in average rents since records began in 2006. Immigration increased private rents by as much as 7%, according to recent research. It also fueled demand for another 205,000 rental homes. The fact that mass immigration is directly fueling our housing crisis clashes with the elite's luxury beliefs, the way in which they simultaneously demand more immigration by knowing full well they and their families are not the ones who will have to compete for scarce housing, rented flats, and social housing. By 2036, Britain's population is projected to increase by another 6.6 million people, 6.1 million of which will be due to immigration. This equates to the population of 5 cities the size of Birmingham and is 70% of the way to a city the size of London in the next 12 years alone. So let's start by having a genuinely honest debate about what is really driving the housing crisis. And that's by accepting one simple fact. Britain cannot sustain mass uncontrolled immigration and also have affordable and available housing. It simply cannot have both. And lastly, if we were serious about wanting to build a more united, cohesive and successful country, then is it not time to recognise that we need to face this crisis head on? That we need to start by lowering the overall level of immigration into Britain year on year, as well as building more homes, adapting the planning system and reshaping our laws. As an architect, I can contribute to addressing the housing crisis by delivering more build-to-rent housing stock in city centres catering to specific demographics. However, this is just scratching the surface of what needs to be done to increase house building to the required levels to accommodate the population shifts occurring now and into the future. Thank you.
Very good. Well, a little bit controversial there, as we say. So I think there's a range of conversations going on here. But I mean, I do think what Helen was saying at the end is possibly more what I thought we could talk about. I mean, because I think it was when we started this conversation, it was said that the Centre for Cities say we need 4.3 million new homes, even though we talk about 300,000 every year. It's actually 4.3. At the rate that we're building them, that's going to take 25 years to hit the target that we have today. And as Helen was pointing out, that goalpost is moving ever upwards. So, we're talking an awful long time unless we try to radically revolutionise housing. And so there's two questions for me. One is that, we build houses by putting one brick on top of another with sloppy mortar in the middle of it. We've been doing that for 5,000 years. You would have thought we'd have come up with something new by now. And secondly, there has been a conversation about modular, or the new kind of style of prefabricated housing, if you like. And those companies are going bankrupt left, right, and centre. So, I mean, I don't really fully understand it myself as to what on earth is going on. That we are, like I said before, the 1951 Conservative Manifesto talking about 300,000 houses. They didn't hit it. They were 60% on target, and we're 60% on target now. And yet we're living in a completely different world to what we were 75 years ago with technology, with robots, with goodness knows what. So is there a possibility of actually solving this problem, regardless of the minutiae of changing planning targets and altering bills and this, that, and the other? Is there a structural problem that we need to address beyond the regulations? Anybody want to have a go on that? I'll come to the audience in a moment, but yes, please.
Can I start, because I may have to run and vote. So first, let's talk about modern building techniques. The reason modern building techniques haven't really taken off is because of old-fashioned business. If you are a supplier of bricks, if you have trained to build in a certain way, and someone brings a 3D printer to your building site, it doesn't get greeted with a big smile. It's more like when they busted up the thread making looms in the old days. People don't want that change. That's the negative end of it. And also the positive end of it, well-built houses using traditional techniques are good places to be and live. So there's a real challenge there. And until modular or 3D printed houses really, really defeat costs, then I think that they're going to struggle. The only other thing that might give them an in is if we start to build so many houses, we need another way, because we're using all the traditional materials and people. I think that's the real challenge there. That's why that hasn't happened.
Okay. I mean, my only response to that is that obviously the Victorian society did actually defeat those people smashing up the looms, and progressed and moved forward, and massive investment was made in mechanism and industrialized processes. So where is that happening now? I mean, it's almost like we've gone back to smashing up our own looms in your analogy.
Yeah, we are still smashing up the looms. Let's be very clear about that. And if the way that will change, the biggest driver in most life now, and certainly in the housing sector, is cost. So as those technologies really demonstrate they significantly reduce cost, I think they'll get boosted. Let's be clear, 3D printing, for instance, is wonderful and can give you high quality buildings. I'm not sure they're any cheaper. So right just now, better the devil you know. If you're getting it for the same cost, but you know what you're doing, you would do that. The whole infrastructure is set up to deliver bricks, dig foundations in the way we do. I think modular has probably demonstrated it does represent good value for money, but the big builders aren't accepting that because they have their mechanism, their systems. That is where political will, changes in the law, very subtle changes in the law, can elevate that. I think we have a building sector that's actually quite innovative and is very competent. And if we could cajole them through law, through tax breaks, through whatever it was, to use these new technologies, I think they would do it. But I want to be very clear. In my mind, it is price that is the biggest driver to if these technologies are adopted or not.
Okay, fair enough. Obviously, price comes down as it gets adopted. It's a bit of a catch-22 there. But also coming back to Simon, I mean, on your suburban ideal, I mean, I'm a big fan of suburbia in many respects. I'm also a big fan of urban developments. And in your booklet, you seem to be slightly dismissive of building more cities. I mean, everybody's dismissive of it, so it's hardly a slur on you. But do you think that there's a place for it, or are we also in the same boat that we just had a conversation with Sean about, that maybe the ambition to build new garden cities or new cities per se is not really on the agenda?
Yeah, I think a couple of points there. One is I'm not opposed to having cities. I think if I put a different hat in, I think sociologically speaking, cities are beginning to become something of a problem. But in terms of solving the housing crisis, urban densification is part of the solution as it stands right now. So we can't prove to be. But my view about this is that we need to try and get to a situation where what drives it is more akin to what happened in either the 1890s or the 1930s, and what Calvin was talking about with transport. I think roads are part of that too. I don't want to dismiss them, which is really to use the development of transport networks and connections and things like that in order to drive in new suburban development and to make it 21st century. That doesn't mean it's good quality housing. It means it's eco-friendly, if you like. You can build it with woods. You can build it with so I think there's a lot of stuff that can be done. And just back to the whole point about modular, I made the comment in my introduction about Sweden, and it was only because I was just reading something about it today. 80% of houses in Sweden are modular, and mostly this is because they have an awful lot of wood. Because and it's managed wood. It's not accidental wood. It's the stuff they plant the stuff deliberately. So actually, if we want to look at how we get different building techniques in, we need to have, deliberately said, plant some trees. I'm not actually, go and talk to the Swedes and say, how do we run this thing? How do we get some of this to work? Let's look at what they do in New Zealand with flat pack housing, or they go back to the 1920s and 1930s in the States, when Sears literally sold houses from a catalogue, and they were then, shipped out and built on. So all you had to do was put the foundations in. Now, regs have changed, makes that more difficult, but there are lots of things there which could be explored, but quite often they're things which our rules and regulations make more difficult, which is so I agree with Sean about building regs, but we need to be pretty careful that we don't actually, having building regs, make it more difficult for us to use innovative approaches to building homes.
Yeah, the tendency is that building regulations are what people are now sticking to. The idea that you have an approved document that you can use as guidelines, whereas in fact people are now using them as the guides itself. That's rather than using it as a stepping off point to do something innovative. People are actually just sticking to the rules because it's safer, and we're living in a rather risk-averse kind of world. So we have to be a little bit cautious, I think. But Calvin, are you still out there? I haven't got you on my screen. In terms of what was just mentioned there about roads as well as rail, does that play any part in your analysis?
I'm not sure. I think definitely, like, the construction of public investment in infrastructure will result in uplift of land values, and I've not looked at the numbers about the effect that road has compared to rail or rail infrastructure. The one thing I would say, back to your point about Ken Livingstone and using land value taxes, the beauty of the Hong Kong rail plus property model is that it captures that land value uplift without adding any new taxes. And the Labour Party has tried to implement land value taxes, I think, 3 times in the 20th century, and it's always failed. And I think the beauty of it is like allowing the public sector, which we have a slight allergy to be a bit more enterprising. And I think the argument on the right is that sometimes we talk about something being privatized without actually saying, are the market competition actually aligned with better outcomes? So I think there's a bit of like ideological kind of debate going on that kind of actually removes the practical kind of solutions that we can approach to infrastructure development.
Okay, maybe 10 years ago I might have accepted a Hong Kong analogy a little bit better than I do about the public sector in Hong Kong today, after the way it's been overridden. But I get your point. Helen, any thoughts on this in terms of develop your argument?
Yeah, so in terms of modular housing, so my experience of modular housing is that the factories just can't withstand fluctuations in the market. So I don't know whether there is a different way of setting up how the factories are actually funded on a sort of longer term basis and protected when the market does fluctuate. Also, in terms of councils having buy-in to the modular concept, for me, normally you have one person spearheading a desire to go down a modular route. And the minute the application is in, then the same sort of design guides and aesthetic controls come in terms of what the output will be, which then absolutely deconstructs all of the efficiencies that the modular would give you at the beginning. So I think there would need to be a separate planning system or guidance for actually how you then deliver modular on scale.
Yeah, don't stop there. like what?
So if you even on small developments, we were working on some modular units where then sort of activated frontages and difference in materials and changes in materiality and how you elevate the modular actually meant that you sort of negated all of the efficiencies that you could have got with the modular. So then it's not kind of competitive economically. So then I sort of don't know whether it's the tail wagging the dog and whether it's a kind of nice to have when we've got modular on the site, but are we actually getting the efficiencies and the speed out of it to deliver more housing?
Okay. I should never ask an architect to have a second bite because then they start talking about activated frontages.
I know. So I nearly did a sketch then.
Anyway, look, I've got a couple of hands. If that's all right, and we'll come back. So I'll take these two hands as it stands. The rest of you out there, if you want to just consider what's being said, or if you want to take this off in a different direction, please do. So I have George Hess, if you want to say your piece.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak for a moment. This is an amazingly broad subject. Some of the speakers that have already flagged up issues are very relevant. For example, Calvin talking about the way that Hong Kong and Singapore operate for the benefit of the public purse. Singapore has got an incredible amount of wealth built up by the way they've operated. And I think that's a very good example to look at. And in fact, if anybody's interested, there's a series of talks by a guy called Andrew Purvis, online talks on Singapore and land value tax and the way they do this. But it has made them very wealthy, and they have got money to spend on infrastructure and improvements. The comment that was made by Simon about building without planning, I would just caution you on that, because in hand with planning has to be the evolvement and development of utilities to go with. You can't go and plonk down a development and not have sufficient sewerage capacity, for example, or school provision, or doctor surgeries. So that is one of the hidden benefits, although I've got to say the planning system is very frustrating, but it is one of the hidden benefits of it that there is a very complicated and somewhat disjointed method of upgrading those utilities and educational provision, for example, in line with growth of housing. So you can't just scrap the planning system and build willy-nilly, because you'd have chaos. The other thing I would like to just say is that a 1.5 million plus shortfall in housing is an absolute crisis. Add to that, possibly, I don't know whether that includes 2.9 million single parents in bed and breakfast accommodation in 2023. It's a total crisis. And the whole system needs a complete revamp and a revolution. And I'm not saying that as a radical or anything. I'm saying that because there are a lot of people who cannot get housing. That is a crisis. Something really radical has to change. And I don't know which government would effect that change, because it would take courage and dedication and long-term policies.
Thanks very much.
Really make the changes. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. I buy into that quite a lot. We have Giovanna.
Yes. Okay, we all agree not enough affordable houses. This is the top political issue in this country. Who can tackle this will win the vote, or the young people, the poor, and old people like me who cannot afford a house in this country. But what I found really problematic in your conversation is the explanation of why are we in this situation. Because what you have talked about is planning. You have totally dismissed the notion, some of you talked about too many immigrants coming in, but you have totally dismissed the debates and the evidence that there is, that one of the reasons is that the houses in this country are not treated like in other countries, like a place to live. In this country, the housing system is totally linked to the financial system, because the house is like a bank account. It's linked to the banks. It's linked to all the policy that the government has pursued to try to create a sense of wealth in this country. Remember, during the financial crisis, the government decided to not allow the houses to fall in prices. They subsidized it through quantitative easing. When there was all this help to buy policy, all the COVID money which were given to the house builder, the special relationship that the big house builder has with the Tory party, that is all about creating a sense of wealth in this country, which is linked to houses. So if you pursue this radical policy you're talking about, modular housing, create cheap housing, you are actually questioning the way in which the upper classes, the people who owns the land, actually have a financial interest in maintaining the class structure, which basically does not allow to build. Because I don't think that it's just a planning. It's also about who owns the land and how wealth is maintained artificially through the financial system that has been created and that now hopefully is changing. And also you have not considered the real question of who owns the land, because the big builders own most of the land. So where are you going to get the land? Sorry, I'm really angry because this is the most important issue in politics and it has ruined my life.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that last point. Hopefully we can, oh my goodness, hopefully we can give you some counselling as we go. I'll just take these two, if you don't mind. There's 3 hands up I can see. If you just wait 1 second. Can I get some comeback on these two very powerful points? One calling for revolution, well, the other one calling for revolution as well, it seems, looking at land values and land ownership. Who wants to come back on this?
Yeah, I could, yes. I want to address some of the because these questions raised by the last person are really quite important, because they're the biggest reasons why we are not addressing the planning problems. We're pretending that the problems are caused by big house builders, land banking, by the financial system, by the way in which we fund housing and house building and the purchase of houses. And that, yeah, there's things, those things are not unimportant, but they aren't the core of the problem. And I think this is really what we're there. And we keep coming back, however, to this, and we see this role financialization. It's those things are actually features of the way in which our housing system operates, because we deliberately constrain the amount of land available, which pushes people towards that being seen as a store of value and as a good investment and as a way of making money. And this is one of the things that militates against us reforming things like the Greenbelt, because and I say this from sitting in the Greenbelt, is that the value of my property is protected by the fact that the field over the road, or actually it's over several roads because of the nature of the topography, isn't going to get developed. And we need to get away from this. We need to stop, because all that financialization is a consequence of the way in which our land markets operate, and our land markets operate the way they do because of our planning system. And we get to the bizarre situation where at the moment, the field at the back of me is probably worth 5,000 quid. If they were to redraw the Greenbelt boundary 100 yards nearer me, it would be worth 800, 900,000 pounds. And that's one of the consequences of the way in which we operate our planning system. And that is one of the reasons why what that lady was talking about is seen as a problem. But in the end, we've got to fix planning first.
So you mean land with planning permission bangs up the value of the land, is what you're saying? And in some parts of the country, by even more than that. Agricultural land values don't vary that much across the country. The good quality land, better quality than the pasture at the back here, will sell for a bit more, 20, 30, 40,000 an acre.
But the reality is that if you're in Surrey and you've got a paddock, an acre's worth of paddock, which currently in the greenbelt is worth 10,000, 12,000 quid, they've got to take it out of the greenbelt and it's worth £2 million. So that's a problem, and it leads, I think, leads to corruption, leads to lots of angry stuff, and we really need to try and fix that.
So very quickly, while I've still got you on screen, it's all very well saying all of that, but obviously the first guy tells me that getting rid of planning would result in chaos. So is that what you're advocating? Some kind of anarchic?
Well, I don't want to get into a long discussion of it. There are some bits of it. What are we saying? Well, yeah, you need some rules and things like that. But if I'm talking about doctors, and I'm talking about schools, and I'm just talking about things like own cars. Do you know something? All the people who are going to move into those houses are already here. They're already got kids in school. They've already got a doctor. They've already got a car and they're driving on the roads. So actually, we're not making, all we're doing is moving stuff around. We're not actually, the money is already in the system. So I don't buy that as an argument against. I think some of the stuff about utilities, but then I can't remember, having sat on planning committees for several years, I cannot remember a single occasion when the electricity company or the water company or the telecoms people objected to a development because they couldn't service it. I just can't remember that happening. So I don't see that, and nor did they want money from the government to make it happen. I do know it's an issue, and without going, I remember talking to the leader of Lincolnshire Council, and he was saying they had some real problems with backlog of work in the utility sector, meaning that they didn't get their plugs and wires onto development sites, which means the development didn't happen. So there was stuff like that, but I don't think that's a really massive issue.
Okay, I mean, it is the case, obviously, that in the Victorian period, some of the wonderful closes and avenues and streets that we most admire were done prior to major planning legislation. Similarly, you can look at thatched cottages and country villages that didn't have any planning legislation, and they seem to have done all right. So maybe we can be a little bit too suspect about people's motivations. Although it's worthwhile keeping a view on it. Anybody else out there? Calvin, you want to come back in and?
Oh, yeah, I just want to come back to something that Giovanna was saying. And I actually totally agree that the concentration of land ownership is an issue. But, short of a peasant uprising overthrowing the landed gentry and the kind of the lords, I think, as Simon says, reforming the planning system is a better way of making sure that the artificial scarcities in land through this kind of very unpredictable planning system is dealt with better. But I would kind of slightly disagree with Giovanna's point about this kind of myth that developers are hoarding all the land. And I think that the idea of land banking has been substantively debunked. But rather, I think one kind of big landholder, which is the UK public sector, the government, I would argue that they are not using the land to the best possible way they can. So, for example, one example is the NHS, which has a massive, vast portfolio of real estate. And the only way they seem to be able to use it at the moment is to sell it off with planning permission to fund their day-to-day spending, when actually a lot of the issues that bad housing or lack of access to housing creates ends up falling back on the NHS's own liabilities in terms of healthcare costs for children with asthma and respiratory diseases, etc. And I think, if the public sector was better at leasing the land out and kind of leaning into the long-term revenue flows of leasing the land out for development and good quality development at that, then actually you would see the NHS reaping the returns of better quality housing. And in some NHS trusts, such as Oldham and near Manchester, or even in Gloucestershire, the NHS trusts are actually paying to upgrade people's homes and their boilers and their insulation, because they know that at the end of the day, they're the ones who's going to be paying for people's doctor's fees. So I would say, even of what land the public does have at the moment, it needs to use it better.
Okay, we won't get into whether the NHS's problem is revolving just about they haven't got enough money, whether it's more significant than that, but we'll let that one lie for now. Of the speakers, are there any, is Sean out there or Helen that want to just make a quick comment before I take some more questions?
No, nothing from me.
No? Okay. We have Joel.
Hello, can you see me?
Yes, indeed. Hi, Joel.
Grant. So I wanted to probe our panel a bit on some of the suggestions we've heard around the exercise of free markets on land and in the kind of as a substitute for a planning system generally, in part because land is the least free thing available. If you want to grow food, there are only some places in the country that you can use to do that. Similarly, if you want to provide houses with very easy access to jobs and access to not stretched public services, there are very few places in the country that you're going to be able to do that. I would like to challenge our panelists to think more about land, less as a kind of magical bottomless pit of money, because it is actually the case also for developers that land is sometimes has a negative value. It costs more as a society to build something and service a bit of land, for example, brownfields that might have contamination or other issues, or to get broadband to a site that's far away, or to get roads and some of the public services that communities think are really important to go in with these services. Like all of these things have quite huge capital costs, and it's not in every place in the country that the development value, the final sale value of the house is going to be able to cover that. So that leaves us as a society with a really difficult question. Do we invest our money as a collective and as a tax base into areas that we think has the greatest opportunity for development, that can provide the greatest outcomes in terms of housing numbers delivered? Or do we want a system built around the rights of the people who live in a place and the future rights of individuals who might one day want to live there? Because I think those two things involve a really huge trade-off. On the one hand, it's fine to say the planning system since 1947 doesn't work at all and we should scrap it. It's got obvious problems. No one will deny that. But the trade-off is, okay, then you have some kind of political government-imposed way of doing things. And if that results in more low-traffic neighborhoods, cowpat development, big bits of huge volume housing dumped in areas where no one wants to live, is that necessarily in the best interest of society and the people who already live there and the citizens who want to go and live in those places? And I think the kind of final question so I would like to hear more from our panelists about what they're more comfortable and where they think the line is between our politics and actually the technical just delivery aspects of planning. Because I think a conversation that doesn't recognise someone who is looking at population figures somewhere should decide this stuff is an acceptable thing to do, then as a society, we're at quite a loss as to how to make decisions in a democratic and useful way.
Very interesting. It's very good because obviously there is a conversation about towns and villages in North Wales or Cornwall or wherever it might be, where people are leaving those places and they're either dying and are there and are very often propped up, subsidised housing for locals to stay. And whether that's a dynamic aspect of urban development or whether they should be allowed to maybe to disappear is a broader conversation, I think. As a matter of fact, people are being subsidised to stay in those areas to the detriment of incomers from that area. So privileged status for local residents, a very interesting dilemma. Then we have Mark and Alex. I have Tim and Claire. If you can just, again, hold fire for a bit. I'll just after I take these next 2 points, I'll bring the answers and then I'll come back out to you. Mark, please.
Hi, Austin. Great introductions and very refreshing to see hear people critical of the planning system. But I almost I agreed with George's sort of defence of the need for some organisation of it. I'm just reading Liam Halligan's book at the moment called Home Truths. It's about 3 years old. It is a really interesting history of the supply of houses, both going back to the post-World War I aspiration to build homes for heroes and conditions that for the rebuilding after the Second World War, which is when the Town and Country Planning Act was introduced, and it's as you said, in the 1940s, 1950s was big house building programs up till the 1970s. There has been the Town and Country Planning Act brought in the Greenbelt legislation, which does mean, as one of your introducers said, that the limits of London have been stubbornly constrained and not allowed our cities to develop. So we don't. There is a perception, I think, and it's not really addressed, that Britain is full, but the actual built-up area is quite a small proportion of what there is. A lot of potential that we could build new towns and cities. And as to the immigration debate, I think immigrants would be great for both the design, the construction, and the more labour, the more better equipped we would be to build the new towns required to house everybody. But there is a big thing about in the economics. In Leon Halligan's book, he says about like going back to the 1960s and the Land Compensation Act, which puts a premium on the land. The price of land was based on the potential if it got planning permission. But if you have Greenbelt saying that, or the National Planning Policy Framework, which has been around for 15 years or so now, suggests that we only build on brownfield sites. Well, that puts a premium on those sites, whereby the land values are going up. The biggest house builders like Persimmon and etc. They actually slowing the supply of houses deliberately. I'm just saying the environmental constraints. I will wrap up. Environmental constraints, and the RIBA having declaring that climate change is the biggest challenge to architects, which is completely wrong. And I think the housing crisis is much bigger than the climate crisis. And I think we just need more free speech. So I'd like a bigger conversation about within architecture. I think we're constraining architects' voices. I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
Grant, thank you very much. Anybody wants to give the RBA a kicking is okay on this panel. Alex, please.
For what it's worth, I'm not an architect. I'm a graphic designer by trade, but I come to this as somebody who's interested more broadly in design issues. In my head, the idiom, where there's a will, there's a way, I think should inform this conversation, or the direction this conversation might take. Because I think, although not unimportant, the question of planning rules, whether we build modularly or traditionally, they're not unimportant, but they kind of fade into the background when we ask, I think, when we ask the question, is there a will to build the amount of homes we need in Britain? In the political sphere, 25 years ago, I designed a book that was called Let's Build 5 million new homes in the next 10 years. 25 years on, that even wouldn't cut it now. So the government's committed to 300,000, can't make it in any shape or form. So the political will among the political class doesn't seem to be there. But when you turn your attention, as I did and do, towards architects and architecture, the will doesn't seem to be there either. Helen mentioned this a bit. If you survey the architectural press, publications, books coming out, commentary, what they're talking about is more retrofit. What they're talking about is just don't build, or what they're talking about is what we need 15-minute cities to constrain populations and stop driving, etc. And as the last Mark made the point, if it's not all that, then it's the environmental catastrophe that faces us. So I don't see a political will among the last 25 years of governments, and I don't see the will among architecture to build. what it's really difficult to find, and I do look into it quite a bit, it's very difficult to find architects or architectural institutions who are saying we need a mass national building programme because we're in a crisis.
Thank you very much. Let me just, can I take Tim and I'll come back to the panel. Tim Butt, please. Have you gone? Tim's just disappeared. Okay, he's turned himself off. All right, look, anybody?
Hey, here I am.
Oh, there you are. Hi.
Couldn't find the mute switch. I wanted to raise the question of this as a sociological issue. I appreciate everybody's talking very much as architects and planners and all the rest of it. In 2001, the census said that by 2030, a third of the population would be over 65. My grandmother died in a 4-bedroom family house in Exeter. I've had other family members, elderly, who have died similarly in large family homes where they're living in essentially one room, maybe using the bathroom and the kitchen, and we're pouring huge amounts of funding into trying to deliver care in places that aren't fit for purpose. Meanwhile, we've got families who want to be families. By families, I mean couples without children yet. And they feel they can't start having children because they can't access family housing, either through lack of supply or through cost. And we've got this problem. I'm sat in leafy Didsbury in South Manchester, where I'm surrounded by a lot of baby boomers and maybe the older end of Gen X sat in large family homes that are frankly underoccupied, but have huge financial value. Meanwhile, there are a lot of very large family-sized homes that are being broken up into one-bed flats. And so what the Labour government did back in the early 2000s, and it wasn't given anything really in the way of headlines, was they changed immigration policy because the statistics say that immigrant families have more children than the British white European families already here. And we needed an increase in the birth rate because the birth rate was slowing, and we needed the revenues that those children who would grow up would then deliver in terms of taxes in order to pay for the bulge in elderly population that we saw coming. And so a lot of the immigration that's happening is by design. It's not because of people just moving around the world. It's because we've taken a policy decision in this country to increase the numbers of people. And so I suppose I want to say two things. Well, I want to point at the sociological issue that actually for young adults who may have aspirations, ambitions towards settling, towards having families, before we even get to infrastructure issues around schools and everything else, that actually they can't get to that housing. At some point, the baby boomer generation will finally pass, and that's not wishing them on their way. Please don't hear me wrong. I don't want to be rude here. But there is going to be a freeing up of family-sized housing over the next 20, 30 years or so. But we're talking a lot about development here without talking about what we're developing and why we're developing it. And I think it was Helen who made the point, we need to talk about immigration. Yes, we do. Not to stigmatize people coming here, but to actually look at our policy. Why have we invited that? What are the issues economically that we're faced with going into the future? And then for you guys who are talking about planning and are architects, I'm not. I'm here from the sociological sort of angle because I'm interested in community. What are cohesive communities going to look like in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time? Because whatever we build now is going to shape the way that community exists into the future. And if we look at immigrant communities from 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, a lot of those communities actually do a much better job than pasty-skinned white Anglo-Saxons like me of looking after their elderly, of looking after each other. And I think this whole question of how are we going to build cohesive community, because a lot of our traditional communities that were built around the idea of a parish and around a cohesive community, which no longer exists in the mind of the white European.
Very good, very good. I mean, I do think there is a little bit of flux even in what you say. I mean, my expertise is on China, and you tend to find that the idea. Well, first of all, the planning policy in China is to build a number. It's an old Stalinist technique. You give local authorities a number of so many million houses you have to build, but you never ask who's going to live in them or what size they have to be. You just provide a provision to meet the target. And the second thing is that even within the last 15 years in China, the idea that you look after your grandparents because that's the fealty that you owe to the older generation, that's disappearing very rapidly as the society progresses. So I think
just grow exponentially.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is, these things do change. So even the example you give, I think, may alter within the next 10 years, regardless. Anyway, let's not me and you have a chat. Right. Okay. So I've got many kind of points on the table. I think it's very interesting that we broaden this out as has been done in the last contribution there. So the speakers, can I come and ask any one of you to kind of comment on what's been said? Joel talking about the free market and moving away from that, and really how kind of towns and villages develop because they're on the most efficient site rather than actually kind of just promoting something for the sake of doing it and then having to invest wildly in infrastructure, all the way through to kind of the potential to build, and then the final points about community development and what that really means. Any speakers out there? Sorry, you're not on my screen, so I'm hoping you'll flash in.
Yeah, if I might, just on that last point about the kind of sociology of it, I think the behaviour of second generation immigrants is not dramatically different from the behaviour of the rest of us. That's the first thing to say. So there's a little bit of mythology around these super cuddly communities. I mean, I speak as someone who lives in Bradford, and we're a very big immigrant population here. But I do think that there are some things which kind of rhetorically got blown, mostly because of the mayor of Paris and her friends, which could have actually been a lot better, which was the whole idea of, it's called the 15-minute city. The whole idea about that became about control rather than the kind of environment in which I live. I live in what is a suburb. The fact that it calls itself a village and it's surrounded by fields doesn't detract from the fact that it's a suburb. The people who live here work in Bradford and Leeds and Halifax and Keighley and Skipton. They don't work or a few work in the village. But we have it's big enough to sustain a doctor's surgery and a school and a co-op and a post office and 4 pubs and 2 cafes. Yeah. The point really, and that's all within 10 minutes walk of where I'm sat now. And that is that, and it's a varied community. And that's, and I'm kind of being a bit starry-eyed here because I like where I live. But I do think that the essence of this kind of suburbia is what we need to try and aspire to. And you don't do that by mandating this is how it looks. You do that by allowing places to grow a little bit bigger, and not just quite small places like that, but even a place like Faversham. There's a massive row happening in Faversham at the moment, which is a lovely market town in Kent, because the Duke of Cornwall wants to build 4,500 houses in a lovely, I mean, it's the old King Charles model Poundbury type thing, lovely development there, urban extension to the town. And it's great because it's going to help sustain the high streets in that town. It helps keep the place vibrant and happy, but they hate it because we can't have any more houses. We're full up and all the usual things. We really need to get over that thing.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Any other points from speakers out there?
Yes, there's just a couple of points I want to address. Firstly, is about the sociology of it all. I'm only interested in the sociology of it all, like any politician should be. That how houses look and all that. That's an issue for architects and builders. That's why in my opening comments I talked about building a house for the journey through life. So, you know, elderly people, smaller house, you know, family and all the rest of that. I have to say, because of the growth in our population, family homes are not going to be freed up. They're going to get even more scarce unless somebody builds new ones. Let's be very clear about that. The explosion on our population far outweighs what's left hanging around. On top of that, I've been doing a lot of work recently on leasehold. And one of the most horrific aspects of leasehold is what they do in elderly villages, communities designed for older people. If we had solved that properly, many more older people could have downsized. Now they'd be crazy to take on one of those leases. So that's something that we have packed up against us. The essence of the generational aspect of housing is twofold. Firstly, most of the people in charge of doing something about housing don't have a housing problem and never have had. So that is why they respond in the way they do. And their children don't have one as well. I remember speaking to a group of people who utterly hated the idea of a new block of flats being built where they live. And I said to them, well, where are your children going to live? And they said, none of our children can afford to live here. And I said, the reason none of your children can afford to live here is because everybody is doing what you're doing now, rejecting everything. I spoke to people who are having houses added to the edge of their village, and they crowed so hard, but then spent the rest of the evening complaining about the pub and the post office dying and the fact that they had to staff the library themselves. Now, at some point, somebody in the political world is going to have to grasp the nettle and say, enough is enough. You either build or your children sleep in tents. What do you want to do here? And unless we have that conversation, we won't. And that's why I talked about the Greenbelt. I remember when I was trying to be selected in my GLHC, I was doing fine until I mentioned the Greenbelt, and that was it. That was the end of me, right? It's the end of me. And look, I want to be very clear. I don't think we should just concrete over the Greenbelt and get on with it. But I do think we should designate the real beautiful parts of this country of parkland and leave them to be parkland. And some of the scrubland surrounding our big urban conurbations, we might have to build them. And when you talk about infrastructure and high streets, what's different now to in the past? A high street had to be a physical place because it's where the transport went through, where people dragged the horse and cart over. Now, many people live either very far away from where they work because of good transport or don't even need to go into work. Now, I'm not one of those who believe in a work from home revolution. I personally think that's nonsense, right? But what makes an area economically viable is slightly different to what it used to be. And what we should be doing is looking at good links. I was anti-HS2, and the reason I was, because I believed all it did was make London bigger, when what we should have been doing is linking the northern cities to each other to make them bigger. That works for housing, it works for business, it works for all sorts of stuff. The point here is, what do we do to make sure that people can live generationally through housing? That's the issue.
Very good. All right, thanks. Good God's sake, don't bring HS2 into this. Right. Look, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to come back out to the questions, and I'll just take whatever comments or points you have to raise, and then everybody on the panel can just kind of sum up and take what you want. So we have Claire Fox.
Right. First of all, a really fascinating conversation. I wanted to say, because it's the first time I've seen him, that Simon, I've got your little pamphlet here in defense of New Suburbia, and it's a cracking read. And thank you. You wrote it for the Academy of Ideas. Really appreciate it, and everyone should have a look at it. But I also wanted to say that on the points that have been made about planning and regulation and so on, let me tell you, in the House of Lords, one of the things that happens is people say we've got to reform the planning legislation. We've got to get rid of all of these over-regulations. And then what happens is you have that conversation, then everyone says we're going to build. And then suddenly, as soon as you stop practically talking about it, environmentalism is used, right? It's always the environment. And the next minute, it's not about planning regulations, it's about retaining environmentalist, sustainable building. And nobody wants to build anything anymore. So I think that some of the points that were made by Mark and Helen at the beginning and Alex are very important to take on board. But what I really wanted to ask the panel was why the construction and development sector are just so risk averse and opposed to innovation and productivity increases. Because I do think that there must be more straightforward ways of building quickly, cheaply, taking into account all of the things that people have said about the need for community and so on. I get all that, but it does seem to me to be part of the crisis of British industry in general, which is that nobody's prepared to take risks, nobody's prepared to invest in new techniques, and everything seems stuck. And that is backward, right? And that is an economic problem that surely we have to deal with. And this actually does lead into, dare I say it, the leasehold question. I know it's partly because Sean and I have both been debating leasehold endlessly in the House of Lords, but it is fascinating that in the 1990s, all of those construction and development sectors basically found a very easy way of making money without very much risk, which was to basically make money, financialize how they made money through huge service charges, ground rent, and ripping off household holders. So it does seem to me that there is a bigger crisis than just the build on the green belt planning situation, both politically, environmentalism, and also the fact that the people who run society won't take risks anymore. And we've got to surely tackle that.
Thank you very much. Good question. I think we're intrigued by the question, as well as the fact you have a hamster with a sombrero on behind you as well. Anyway, Nico, please.
Thank you. I had a question for a couple of the speakers individually. Calvin, I was fascinated by your discussion about Hong Kong and the Transport Authority combining transport development with property development. I guess TfL does that to an extent, and whatever it's called, Network Rail, has done in various guises for, well, since Broadgate really in the 90s, but maybe it's not the same. A lot of people argue that because Britain's a democracy, highly developed, etc., there is a barrier to getting things done because everyone has to be consulted. Whereas Austin talked about the construction in China, which is obviously not a democracy. Hong Kong is for the time being. What role do you think the democratic process has, if any, in inhibiting construction? This also relates a bit to the idea of NIMBYism, which we've alluded to. And at a conference I put together called The Great Stagnation, Sam Richards, who some people might know, talked about NIMBYism being the strongest political force in Britain today. He runs something called Britain Remade. Is NIMBYism a problem? Do we have a solution to it? Someone's put in the chat, blame the boomers, force us to sell. Is that the plan? Are the boomers the NIMBYs? And finally, I was interested in Simon's discussion about, I think Simon and Sean, about planning and the limits of planning. And Nicholas Boyd-Smith, who some people might know from Create Streets, argued at the summit that we need clearer planning, and that's how we fall back in love with the future. I'd be interested to know if there's any chance we might get to clearer planning, not least around the green belt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nico. Rowan.
Thanks, Austin. Just a quick question. The gun city movement was mentioned in the opening remarks. How applicable does the panel think that is to the modern age, both in architecture and in town planning?
Wow, very good, very good. Thank you very much. Sheila.
Hi, just a couple of points from me. I've lived and worked in Manchester for a long time now. Just a few points. I think it was Alex talking about architects. Architects don't build houses. They just work within the conformity of where the clients are, to state the obvious. I think it's a mistake also to separate housing market discussion from demand in general. Where do people want to live? Part of the title of the event. Where are people going to live? Where do people want to live? They want to live where there is work. And I don't think we can separate housing from work. I think, and the pattern of that in the UK has changed a lot. So I think we should, my personal view is I think we should focus all resources on where there is demand to live, which brings us back to cities. So we mentioned land ownership as well along the way. I think land ownership is where every plan starts, whether you're a town planner or an architect, whatever plan you're coming up with across the UK. Who are the landowners? Who owns the land? I'd agree with those who were talking about public authorities needing to use their land we said more efficiently. I think Claire was talking about risk. Public authorities do take risks, and many of them have become bankrupt in recent years as a result of the risks that they've taken within the development industry and with regard to the land that they own, and decisions, quite often with worthy objectives, but when you're operating within a market, it's possible you'll end up bankrupt. Local authorities and other landowners, somebody was talking about the NHS. I've got recent experience with National Grid. It's not just NHS, they own land. If you look at National Grid, their remit nationally is to demolish all gas holders and to sell the land to the highest bidder for housing. So you think, great, let's build houses. No, the land is contaminated. The land has got a huge number of constraints under the surface. And there are so many things that are wrong with the system at the moment. I think it's quite hard for us, even in the industry, who are professionals in the industry, to know which part of the dysfunction should we start with. And then the final point I'd make is the guy who was on a couple of speakers ago, who must live around the corner from me, but I don't know him because we don't know neighbours anymore, even though I've lived here 30 years. So he lives in South Manchester. Baby boomers will pay for their kids' housing forever from now, and their own care as well, their elderly care. So we need the equity in our homes. Thank you very much. We're not giving them up. The purchase of my mother's council house under Right to Buy paid for her care. There are so many factors in this discussion. I don't think we should separate housing from economy, from care, from social and sociology. They're not separate things, they're all linked together. That's my Austin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was going to say short and sharp, but the opposite.
Almost.
Patrick.
Yes, so, well, George said we need a revolution. I absolutely subscribe to this, and it must be a libertarian revolution. So I would bet fully on free market processes, and we can do that step by step. The first thing is, yes, the planning system needs to shift to a rule-based system. All this discretionary negotiation has to stop. It's also the whole thing of land use planning. These land use plans are very old and non-adaptive. Conversions are difficult. We had this wonderful area of the PDR, permitted development rights, has been curbed and cut back. There's now a burden with regulation also. And I think the market will also solve the question, should it be suburbia, should it be brownfield and urban sites? That's the market will decide that. Also, what kind of units will be needed when and where, whether it's family units or single and small units. At the moment, it's big, very, very small units in urban centers. That's been recently the big demand, and that hasn't been met because the government the planning system, the GLA, are not only making everything extremely slow, they don't allow enough density. I've talked to developers, I said, well, I could have done double of here, but also there's this full subscription of the, not only which categories of use are allowed at all. Once you have residential, there's a prescription of of the unit mix, how many 4-bedroom, how many 3-bedroom, how many 2-bedroom, the size of each room, minimal provisions, minimal features and provisions in each flat, balconies, green. I mean, it's endless. There's just basically all entrepreneurship in that realm has been killed off. And all what developers doing, they're basically hope and think they know better, the councillors and the ins and outs, to get a slightly reduced deal in a negotiation. So that's why they're bidding something for this. They have nothing to offer. And that's really no market at all in many respects. And that's why we have this crisis. Of course, NIMBYism is a huge problem. All these examples where people refuse to approve or go against buildings in their neighborhood, they should have no such right. I don't think that democracy needs to extend to that I'm living in this area and now have a right of veto, or I can drum up a majority. This should be a private matter. And this is, it's the way if you open a business, you can't prevent the competitor to open something around the corner or somewhere else. And that's the same thing. I think that's the huge thing. So democracy, it's not yes or no, but the scope of participation and this sense of owning a district through the councillors and the political process, that's a huge problem. Massive problem. Of course, the government has realized that. That's why they overrule this and cut into this, because if there's all kind of NIMBYism would rule, you could do absolutely nothing. But Britain hasn't been able to do a single runway in the last 40 years. Et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's what I'm talking about, a revolution, and that revolution needs to have some bold steps. Doesn't have to be all delivered at once, but the direction of travel is liberalization and degrees of freedom, and free land use, freeing up the land. And I think the one more point, the example of the 19th century is interesting, or even 18th century, the way the London was developed. These were, and that's why the leasehold system also, you cannot say, let's scrap that. These are institutions was developed, the great estates, the way developed and curated through private planning, a district and a value proposition. So some of this planning, inverted commas, ordering, can be done also through private means. And the current political means is chaos, because
Okay, Patrick,
arbitrarily settled things, and I leave it at that. So
we're running out of time.
chaos is on the
Sorry.
side of politics, and the
Very good.
spontaneous order is on the side of the private processes.
Yes, Patrick is against micromanagement. Short headline. Good luck. We've got 3 people sticking their hands up. Can't take any more. So I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to be a bit short and sharp, but you could. Jane, please.
Yeah, I'm sitting here in Canary Wharf, which was built for one purpose, which appears no longer to be viable. We've got HSBC over there. You probably can't see it out the window, but that's about 44 floors of offices, which will be vacant in 2027. I'm just surprised that nobody has discussed the idea of repurposing some of the enormous amount of real estate we already have in towns and cities all over this country. Is that not viable? Could that not be turned into housing, for example? Could many shops, like my son lives in Sevenoaks, whole street full of shops which are no longer occupied, including a giant Tesco's. Why isn't that housing? And how could it be made so? That's the end of me.
Not literally, but I think you have a point. I mean, especially since, ironically, lockdown suggested that I was very surprised when people moved back into apartments in the central cities, because people fled in lockdown to find someone with a garden. So there are bigger equations to be mapped out here, as a gentleman said earlier, sociologically as well as just economically. But you have a very interesting point and a great view, I have to say. Lizia.
Hello. So some people mentioned immigration here today, and I think I'm probably the only one speaking from outside the UK. And I was thinking about the state of Texas in the US, and they were in the news recently with the immigration crisis from illegal immigrants from Latin America, but they also are under pressure because they have internal immigration from people from other states, especially high net worth people from the tech industry. And you can see the difference of the housing situations in the big states in Texas, like Houston, Austin, Dallas. And I was checking the situation in Austin, and the city center is regulated like most of the cities in the US, but the outskirts, they have no land use regulations. It's actually 2 pages long, including one big map. And I was checking over the last decade, the homelessness in the state dropped 30%, opposite to other states who also have the immigration crisis, like California and Florida. And the price of homes did not rise as much if you consider the huge net growth of population that the state have, especially in the outskirts, because in the city centers where it's highly regulated and many interest groups can use those regulations to stop development, they see the same problems as other cities with homelessness and with increasing the prices. So I think it would be interesting to take a look from an example outside of Europe, especially when we say that low regulation would bring chaos. It's not really what we see there, and about the prices, because otherwise only people with a lot of money can invest.
That's very good. I think it's, I mean, I said earlier on, I'm going to do a separate discussion later on in the year, which will be taking a look at America and Canada, China, and what have you, to try to learn some lessons from there. That's a research project you're giving us at the moment. So I'm very, very keen to find out more about that. Alistair.
A couple of quick points, and partly because there's so many planners and architects on this conversation, then let me just say that I think Sheila lets architects and planners off the hook a little bit easy, to be quite honest, because yes, they may be working to clients, and yes, they may have to get their buildings through planning and get them built. But the fact is that the architects as a profession and as individuals have completely accommodated to the anti-development mentality of the last 30 or 40 years that's grown up. And I think they really have to take responsibility for that, because if anybody should be trying to inspire us with decent plans and imaginative buildings. And obviously this doesn't apply to everyone, but to a fairly large percentage of the architectural community, if you like, they have completely curtailed their ambitions and completely stepped back from some of the imaginative and very ambitious plans that we might have seen from that profession in the past. So if anybody needs to take a lead, then it does strike me that it is within architecture and planning. Secondly, to Patrick, libertarian revolution, I think maybe a political revolution might suit us a little bit better, Patrick, because the fact is that even in situations where large companies and large corporations that have the capacity to forge ahead and to make something of the situations that they're in, they've stepped back as well and not been able to offer anything that can take us out of this situation. Lots of companies, lots of corporations have lots of money, but they don't seem as if they've got much capacity to have the imagination to invest it. And I thought Helen made a fairly decent point right at the start, where she said that the kind of fluctuations in the system are quite important in terms of modular building. But it seems to me that it's the lack of intention and ambition to overcome those that are the real problem. So I think a bit less risk aversion and a bit more ambition would be the way ahead.
Thank you very much. Okay, look, we're back to the panel in reverse order, and you don't have much time. There's a million questions on the table. You can't possibly address them all. Just pick on something that you want to, or sum up in your own words. So if I can take Helen first,
Yeah,
please.
absolutely. I completely agree with Alistair that there's a lack of ambition in architecture. I think education at the moment is getting caught up with quite left-leaning, ideological degrowth, net zero, no new building. And I think it's hobbling creativity. I think more censorious environments in universities are hobbling creativity. And I think what that's leading to is a lack of entrepreneurship and a lack of innovation. I would love to see architects running with this and actually, I don't know whether we're scared to be utopian now after some of the failures of the past. And we're just trying to kind of retrofit and occupy old brutalist buildings rather than come up with our new utopian. But yeah, I do take responsibility personally and as a profession for a sort of a lack of gusto and even a lack of care in terms of family housing and the want to deliver family housing.
Thanks. So it's your fault.
Yes.
Thank you. Right, Calvin, please.
Yeah, I mean, what a vast amount of issues. I think to answer a few of the questions, why don't developers take risk? Claire's point, I would argue all the appetite for risk is consumed by our planning system. Jane's point about why empty buildings, such as commercial buildings, aren't being repurposed quickly enough. I would argue another barrier to that is the planning policy and which land use designations for those areas. And finally, the point about democracy, shouldn't everyone have their say? Well, I would argue that Britain's system of private property rights was the most democratic system, where if you own the land, you have the right to build on it. And what's changed since 1947 was that was nationalized, bought by the socialist Attlee Labour government. And so now that's like that the government has a total monopoly of development rights, and everyone is lobbying the government in all different directions to hand them back out as in the form of planning permission. And I'd argue a lot of the issues that I brought up and brought up by the audience and the panel, is this country's obsession with centralization since the 1940s. Nationalized rail, nationalized development rights, nationalized healthcare. And I think we need to really have an honest conversation about this legacy from the World War II era. And I argue that we tend to hide behind the fact that these were done out of good intentions. But what we don't talk about is that this has distorted the incentives, right? It's distance kind of where consequences are caused with who is responsible from the end, because under the centralized system, it's always the government is the safety net of last resort. And until we can decentralize some of that power, decentralize some of that control, we will never have a functioning and thriving economy. So I'll end on that.
Wow, very good, very powerful. That's almost another spark to another conversation, Calvin, but needs must, and we'll move on, but we'll come back to it some other time. Thank you very much. Simon.
Yeah, I mean, when Ebenezer Howard built Letchworth, what he did was he got in a horse and cart, probably, and he went up into Hertfordshire and he bought some agricultural land in an area which he thought was quite a nice place for a thing. And he knew that there was going to be some railways being built and some improvements to that. So he bought that land at agricultural land prices and he built a town on it. You couldn't do that today. You literally could not do that. So when people talk about garden cities, we literally cannot do what Ebenezer Howard wanted to do. I mean, I could be quite critical of him. I think it was all a bit twee at times. But absolutely, we couldn't. So if we actually want him, we want to get to a situation where we get back to people like Ebenezer Howard being able to take their inspired ideas and go and implement them. And rapacious little, and he said something rude there, like the man in my book, John Cater, who built Beckenham, purely because he, having conned the land out of his family, he then made himself very rich. So, but you know, those kind of people we need more of that kind of stuff, because they built Britain. And just as an aside, as Austin knows, I wrote a piece once called "We Live in a Land of NIMBYs, governed by NIMBYs, administered by NIMBYs." And we can't build prisons, we can't build power stations, we can't build ports, we can't build anything. And we need to start somewhere. And I actually think the place to start, because it's the line of least resistance right now, is to start building some houses.
A couple of things. Firstly, international comparisons are often not worth it, because you're not comparing like with like. Our economy does not resemble Texas's in any way. NIMBYism is such a powerful force in politics. I really don't know how we're going to overcome that. If someone has an idea, please send me an email. The planning, we all know planning's a problem, but nobody's done anything about it. I think regional power is probably the best way to get about planning. Centralization has made planning more and more and more powerful. Garden cities are relevant in that we have to build something. You can't, I'm a fan of suburbs. You can't build suburbs unless you have a city to build them around. And I think they are a relevant way of providing that journey through housing life. And look, if we cannot answer the housing problem, we are no longer a civilized country. Housing is fundamental to human survival. There's some versions of human survival where you need a house before you can eat. If we can't answer that, what are we bothering for? What's the point of being a functioning democracy if the democracy can't build houses?
Very good. I won't dispute that. Let me just quickly say that I mentioned at the very beginning that Starmer and Rachel Reeves, their new big idea is to bulldoze the planning system, as they call it, and suggesting that mayors are going to have new powers to budget and to mandate planning powers. So whether that's a good thing or bad thing, and the local elections will determine who gets in to actually do that, it does seem to be more like an anti-democratic and technical response than something necessary to look forward to. For me, just very quickly, since I'm going to get my 5 penneth in, the lack of housing, as was just said at the end there, is an eternal question, but historically, there always was some answers to it. Do you know what I mean? Like, so whether it was the garden cities, whether it was the Addison Act of building social housing after the First World War, whether it was prefabs and new towns, whether it was demolishing and high-rise in the 70s, or whether it was modular in the 2000s, it was always an idea that, you know, we could maybe build something that there was. And then today we have an opposite kind of resolution or understanding that actually building is a problem or problems are irresolvable. And that idea about growth and development have been replaced, as people have said, by demands for restraint and restrictions and localism, which whether that's in the construction industry, whether it's in the planning law, whether it's in government, or whether it's in the education system, this is something we have to really tackle. So it's almost like, don't expect to ask for a nuclear power station anytime soon. Just get a heat pump. Don't ask for lower energy bill. Insulate your house. Don't wear a jumper. Don't build a reservoir. Use less water. And this is the kind of the biggest challenge. I think is to fight against the logic of low horizons. And if we can't win that ideological battle, then we'll never believe that we should build it or could build any more decent housing. So for me, it's a kind of a broader, somebody mentioned sociological, I would say political discussion to be had out. I think we've made a reasonable start on it today, more than reasonable. I thought it was very entertaining and very encouraging conversation. So thanks to all the speakers, and thank you all indeed for your contributions. Get a copy of Simon's little pamphlet on suburbia. Thank you all. Let's have a round of applause if you want to unmute and just give everyone a round of applause, please.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.